What Enders discovered when he compared these different records is that the Smith family farm ranked larger in size and was better maintained than the majority of their neighbors. Ezra Taft Benson, Gordon B. Hinckley, Joseph F. Smith, they're vindicated. They were right all along. The story of the Smiths is a story of honor and a story of integrity, and now we can prove that with data. The treasure digging sources that Richard Bushman used in Rough Stone Rolling are not credible, and this is why. Let's go into that. So there was a study that was done in 1993 by a man named Donald L. Enders. And Enders, what he did is he decided to approach this really from a new angle. You see, people have been discussing and debating this for decades, right? And some people have been saying, Mormonism Unveiled is accurate and it really needs to be given careful consideration. And then you have others who say, no, it's hogwash, throw out the whole thing. And Enders said, okay, let's go and look at the affidavits in Mormonism Unveiled and other statements published in other anti-Mormon publications, other statements made alleging that Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging. We're going to look at all of those, he said, and then let's test it against all of the available historical data we have. Let's analyze the land and tax records. Let's look at the farm account books. Let's look at soil surveys and archaeological records, and those are scientific. Those are facts. Because we can debate opinion all day long. I can sit here and explain maybe why I think a source is biased, and I could talk to a progressive and they can explain why they don't think it's biased. And we can go back and forth all of day long and debate arguments that sure have merit. But at the end of the day, if we can test these statements against scientific data, we're talking about data that is black and white, and isn't subject just to someone's emotional interpretation, then maybe we can really evaluate and actually close the case of whether these affidavits and these statements are authentic. Can we authenticate or disprove them? And that is what Enders did, which was a brilliant idea. Starting, Enders said, okay, according to all of these different affidavits and different stories, the Smith family was lazy, they were indolent, they were these beggarly fortune tellers who believed in ghosts and witches. They were ignorant. They didn't have any discipline. They had no vested interest in earning an honest income to sustain themselves. Joseph Capron's affidavit said that Joseph Smith and the whole family of the Smiths were notorious for indolence, for foolery and falsehood. Their great object appeared to be to live without work. So that's one of the affidavits. Another statement says, Joseph Smith Jr., the pretended prophet, used to pretend to tell fortunes, and he had a stone which he used to put in his hat by means of which he professed to tell people's fortunes, end quote. So here we are. Here's the story. Is it true? Well, Enders' research ended up exonerating the Smiths and exonerating the traditional narrative, and he found that the story that these affidavits were telling was not true. It couldn't be substantiated by the facts. So one of the things that Enders did is he went and he analyzed the New York tax records. He went and he compared Joseph Smith Sr.'s farm with about 175 farms in the area at the time that the Smiths were living there. So when he went and he analyzed all of these farms, he found out that only 71 were valued higher per acre. 14 were valued about equally per acre. So about 14 were pretty similar in value to the Smith family farm. And then 90, so definitely a more significant number, were valued at a market level that was below that of the Smith family farm. In other words, 51.43% of the farms in the area were of lower quality and value. Only 40.5% of the farms ranked higher. This is very significant. Only 8% were of comparable value. So in other words, what we're saying here is the Smiths had a farm that was definitely middle class or above middle class. So here's the Smiths, and these affidavits are saying, the Smiths were so poor and they were just beggarly and just kind of running around wild. And yet when we look at their farm, we say, well, actually, they had a farm that was valued higher than 51.43% of the farms in the same area. So that was when Enders looked at the value of the farm. Then he went and he looked at the size of the farm. So he evaluated 253 farms in Manchester Township. Of the larger farms, he found that only 24.51% of the farms were larger. That's 62 farms. And then he went and he said, well, how many of the farms are smaller? And he found that 2/3 of the farms, about 66.4%, were smaller than the Smith farm, and some were considerably smaller. 168 farms were smaller. And then similar sized farms was about less than a tenth, about 8.7%, about 22 farms. So what Enders discovered when he compared these different records is that the Smith family farm ranked larger in size and was better maintained than the majority of their neighbors. So here's the Smiths building this valuable homestead. They have respectability and civility among their fellow citizens. And this shows that, hey, these claims being made by a lot of times lower class residents around them were not true. And then what he did is he did something else that was fascinating. He said, well, let's go look at the farms of those who were doing all this bad talking against the Smiths, all the ones who were like, oh yeah, the Smiths were fortune tellers and they were lazy and they were couldn't keep a job down. And he said, well, let's go look at their farms. What were their farms like? And he found that those people who were so vindictive against the Smiths primarily owned and worked farms that were smaller in size and of lower value than the Smiths' farms. And he said, that's pretty interesting. He said, quote, the Stoddards, and just have to clarify, these Stoddards, no relation to us. But the Stoddards, Chases, and Caprins were neighborhood residents who spoke poorly of the Smiths. Only one of the 10 families in this 4-family group had property assessed more valuable than the Smiths. And of the 5 families in the Stafford family group, none had a higher appraisal than the Smiths. In comparison to others in the township and neighborhood, the Smiths' efforts and accomplishments were superior to most. So in other words, what he is saying is okay, all these people that are talking so bad about them, their property was not as valuable as the Smiths. And specifically, if you look at the Stafford family, who was very vindictive against the Smiths, none of them had a higher appraisal than the Smiths. So we need to ask ourselves, wait a minute, are we seeming to tap into some ulterior motive? What's going on here? Why are these people who are not as well-to-do as the Smiths talking so badly against them and talking about how as if they are so superior and the Smiths are the beggars in the group? So let's look at David Stafford's statement in Mormonism Unveiled. He said, it's well known that the general employment of the Smith family was money digging and fortune telling. It's well known, right? They kept around them constantly a gang of worthless fellows who dug for money at nights and were idle in the daytime. So see this picture that David Stafford is promoting? Okay, here's the Smiths just sitting around during the day. Richard Bushman in Rough Stone Rolling tries to portray Joseph Smith Sr. as a drunk. So here we've got, the Smiths sitting around in rags, drinking during the day, and then at night, they have this gang that goes around with them digging for money in the nights with their lanterns, right? He's kind of setting this mood. And he says, David Stafford says, it was a mystery to their neighbors how they got their living. Like, how are the Smiths even living when they're so lazy they can't do anything? Well, that's interesting, David Stafford, because if I remember right, your family doesn't even have a farm as high in value as the Smiths. William Smith, who was Joseph Smith's younger brother, he actually commented on this interesting irony, and he made the observation that he believed that the neighbors were, quote, a little jealous of the Smith family. He was asked a question. It is said that Joseph and the rest of the family were lazy and indolent. William Smith responds, We never heard of such a thing until after Joseph told his vision. Interesting timing. And not then by our friends. Whenever the neighbors wanted a good day's work done, they knew where they could get a good hand, and they were not particular to take any of the other boys before Joseph either. We cleared 60 acres of the heaviest timber I ever saw. We had a good place. We also had on it from 12 to 1,500 sugar trees, and to gather the sap and make sugar and molasses from that number of trees was no lazy job. We worked hard to clear our place, and the neighbors were a little jealous." End quote. Now, the interesting thing is William Smith actually ended up, he did not stay with the church. He didn't follow Brigham Young and the Saints out to Utah, but he never went back on his statements on Joseph Smith's character. He never, this statement comes from later in his life, but he never went and said, well, actually, Joseph Smith was lazy or anything like that. Instead, he always maintained that the Smith family was respectable, that they were very solidly Christian, and that they were hard workers. He said, if you will figure up how much work it would take to clear 60 acres of heavy timberland, heavier than any here, trees you could not conveniently cut down, you can tell whether we were lazy or not. And Joseph did his share of the work with the rest of the boys. We never knew we were bad folks until Joseph told his vision. We were considered respectable till then, but at once people began to circulate falsehoods and stories in a wonderful way. So what do we have going on here? We have the Smiths being actually respectable members of society until Joseph Smith starts talking about angels, and he starts talking about God appearing to him, and he starts talking about ancient records, and then the persecution begins. Then all of a sudden the Smiths are awful, the Smiths are evil, and the Smiths are lazy bums. But this all happens after. Joseph Smith wrote a letter to James Arlington Bennett, and he made the observation that any man or woman who is righteous is going to be persecuted. In other words, if you're not being persecuted or you're not being lies being stirred up against you, then that's not consistent with the pattern of great men and women in history. Joseph Smith said, "Sir, I will assure you that my soul soars far above all the mean and groveling dispositions of men that are disposed to abuse me and my character." He says, "I therefore shall not dwell upon that subject." He says, "I'm so different than all of these people that are trying to tear me down. In relation to those men that you speak of, referred to above, I will only say that there are thousands of such men in this church who, if a man is found worthy to associate with, will call down the envy of a mean world because," right now this is key, why are good, honorable men and women envied? And why are they torn down? Because of their high and noble demeanor. So just as William Smith said, hey, we had some neighbors that were a little jealous of us. And just as Joseph Smith says, any righteous man or woman, as soon as they start standing for truth and being high and noble, those who are groveling, as he uses the word, those people will be envious of the person who is trying to be righteous. And this is a fundamental principle to recognize, because otherwise you look at Joseph Smith and you're like, okay, well, if Joseph Smith was such this amazing guy and such a hard worker and all these things that we'll talk about soon, why do people hate him? Like, what's he got against him? And we could ask the same question about Jesus Christ. Here's Jesus Christ, who's perfectly sinless. He's perfectly loving. He's perfectly forgiving. He's never made a mistake in his life. And yet people hated him. They hated him so badly that they killed him. Why? And then why are we surprised that the same thing is happening with Joseph Smith? So let's go back to Enders' study. So the other thing that he did is he noticed that the assessment rolls initially valued the land as underdeveloped. So when the Smith family purchased their property, it wasn't as though, oh, well, the Smiths bought this ready-made farm and all they had to do was keep it up. When they bought the land, it was completely undeveloped and it was worth only $700. 10 years later, with the Smiths working their tails off, the property had nearly doubled in value, with the appraisal set at $1,300. So Enders said, hey, that was interesting. Well, what did they do? What made their property so valuable? What did they change? Well, when the Smiths bought their property, it was heavily forested, but the Smith family cleared 60 acres of land. The estimate is that they hewed down approximately 6,000 trees, averaging 4 to 6 feet in diameter. That's a lot of trees. Then they had to fence the property, and that required moving tons of stone from fields to the farm perimeter and then cutting and placing all the boards, about 4,000 10-foot rails. I don't know how many people watching this have done farm work, but there's no equipment, there's no excavators, there's no loaders and tractors and Lowe's and Home Depot to run and buy drills and saws and all of that, right? They're doing this with no modern technology. And it's just the Smith family here. And look at how much they are accomplishing. Not only that, but they planted an orchard, they installed fencing, they built a barn for their animals, they erected a shop, and then they built an unfinished frame home requiring about 2,000 to 3,000 wooden rails. So then Enders took each of these things, clearing the 60 acres, building the barn, building the cooper shop, the animal enclosures, the frame home, and he started totaling up, okay, here's the value to come up with, okay, what were these improvements to the Smith land that increased the value so much in that assessment roll? So again, we can see just very clearly, like these are just facts. These aren't manipulated by emotion or your bias of someone trying to prove that Joseph Smith was a prophet. These are just facts. And they clearly disprove that the story in Mormonism Unveiled and the story told by these neighbors that were so eager to run around and talk about how lazy the Smiths were is just nonsense. The story that the Smith family was lazy and indolent and believed in ghosts and witches and just all the energy of their mind was directed towards finding treasure. That's all they could think about. It's just not substantiated by the record. How could the Smith family get so much work done, and how could they improve their land to the extent that they did, and not only have a farm that was that habitable, but put in the industry required to make those improvements if they were running around digging for treasure all of the time? It just doesn't make sense. But then we don't have to just look at the Smiths' own land, like were the Smiths just putting all of their energy into their own home? Well, interestingly enough, they were actually doing a lot of contract work off of their property for others. They dug and rocked up wells, they did mowing, they did coopering and repairing barrels, they constructed cisterns, harvested crops, dug for salt, constructed stone walls and fireplaces, flayed grain. They did butchering, dug coal, hauled stone. This is all labors that the Smith family did. That's a lot. Okay, so what we're saying is basically they already did all of this work on their own property. Plus, they were going and doing work for others that consisted of all these things that not only required a lot of labor, but also required skill. Not just anybody can go and construct cisterns and construct barrels, right? So not only do they have all of these skills, but they're putting them to work and doing contract work for those around them. Enders noted that at least 8 wells in 3 townships are attributed to the Smiths. They likely dug and rocked others, including some of the 11 wells dug on the farm of Lemuel Durfee. So we might be saying, wow, okay, yeah, we definitely showed that these affidavits are not true and that the Smiths weren't these lazy bums, that they were hard workers. But there's even more. So the Smiths were not only improving their farm, they not only kept their farm up, and they not only were doing work for others, labor for others, but they also constructed items that they then resold. And some of the things that we know that they did is that they sold splitwood chairs and baskets, cordwood, modest carpentry work, cider. They sold garden produce, bee gum, maple syrup and maple sugar. So these are all items that they're going and they're making or growing or producing, and then they're reselling them in addition to all of their farm and off-farm labors. And yet, in addition to all of that, there is even more. The Smiths also did work hunting and trapping. They taught school, provided domestic service. They did carting. They washed clothes. They painted oilcloth coverings. They painted chairs. The Smiths are absolutely extraordinary. I think I could easily say that I am not aware of one 21st century family that could beat the Smiths in their level of industry and their work and what they produced. Even Fawn Brodie, who was definitely antagonistic towards Joseph Smith, even she acknowledged the Smiths family efforts. And she said that the family, quote, made 7,000 pounds in one season and won the $50 bounty for top production in the county, end quote. So here's the Smith family. Lucy Mack Smith talked about how in 1 year they made maple sugar off of their property. And she noted that each year they averaged 1,000 pounds per year. Daniel Peterson said, okay, that sounds like a big number, 1,000 pounds per year. But for those of us that maybe are not quite familiar with that process, let's talk about what that means. What was required to produce that 1,000 pounds of maple sugar? Well, that would have required tapping more than 500 trees, then collecting 60,000 pounds of sap, and then burning 10,000 pounds of wood for perhaps a week of 20 to 24-hour days to boil off all of the water. Okay, so then think about it. They're not just importing these logs. So if they're going to burn wood to burn off that water, they are not just running to Lowe's or importing big bundles of firewood. The boys are, Father Smith and the boys are going out into the woods. They're cutting down trees. They're hauling them over, they're burning them. You have Mother Smith and the girls and others, they've got to stir those pots, they've got to keep them going. Someone's got to go tap all of those trees, do all of that work. This is a very involved process, and I think it's important to remember it's not as though the Smiths are sitting there like, yeah, well, it's a whole family of adults. No, it's not like that, right? The Smiths, there's young children, there's toddlers. During this process, sometimes Mother Smith was pregnant. This is a normal family trying to raise children and go through all of that and all that entails, and they're still accomplishing. They're building this amazing homestead. They're doing all of this work for the neighbors. They're producing items for resale. They're making all of this maple sugar. Like, how are they accomplishing so much work? And some of us might just sit back in exhaustion just looking at these lists and say, well, obviously they were workaholics and they didn't think or do anything else. Did they even sleep? Right? And yet this is absolutely astounding to me. The Smiths accomplished all of that work, and yet they did not allow their industry to take precedence or priority over their religious life. The Smith family, I want everyone to think about, okay, how many times have you sat and thought, oh, I need to do better on my scripture study goals. I need to do it every day. Or parents and families sit down and say, okay, we're going to do family night every week. Like, we're going to do this. And how many times do we fail and how many times do we succeed? Well, the Smith family was not only doing all of this work, but they held family devotionals twice every single day. And these devotionals were amazing devotionals. They involved prayer and singing together and studying the scriptures. Mark McConkie, who was Brewster McConkie's son, he said, really, Father Smith almost had his own homeschool, and he used the Bible as his curriculum. And they had these devotionals twice a day. And sometimes they had a special spot in the forest where they could go and they could gather and have their family devotionals out in nature. And they prayed and they sang, and the children remembered this. And there's other accounts of families later on going to the Smiths because everyone knew, they just loved to participate in these family devotionals. They were inspiring and they were rejuvenating. So the Smith family is doing family devotionals twice every day, in addition to all of the other work that they're doing. This is an absolutely incredible family. Do you know any family that you could compare and say, oh yeah, they could accomplish as much as the Smiths? It absolutely blows me away. But Joseph Smith continued that family tradition of doing family devotionals twice every day. 3 times a day is how often he did it, which I want you to think about Joseph Smith, how busy he was, how much he accomplished in his life. He's studying Hebrew, he's building temples, he's literally building cities, he's doing political work, he is restoring revelations, he's teaching people, all of this that he accomplished. And yet 3 times a day, according to Eliza R. Snow, he would sit his family down and they'd have family worship. And Eliza R. Snow said that these were precious seasons of sacred household service, and they truly seemed a foretaste of celestial happiness, end quote. I think it's important to step back and see this other perspective of, okay, who really was the Smith family? Because when you read these statements by neighbors and these antagonistic reports and tales, they're going to tell you, oh, the Smith family, right? Like we read before, they're lazy, they believe in ghosts and witches, they're just running around with their treasure hunting friends. And yet, when you actually look at the data and see, okay, well, what was their farm really like? And what were they accomplishing? And what was all of the work that they were accomplishing? And then when you recognize on top of that, here's the children remembering years later, like William Smith, yeah, we had family devotionals twice every day. That was a priority. Here's Joseph Smith. He's having family scripture study 3 times a day. And so instead of looking down at the Smiths with apology and saying, yeah, that was Joseph Smith, he really needed to grow up. He needed to extricate himself from this, as Bushman said, this treasure hunting and lowly beginning. Instead, when we look at the Smith family, honestly, their family should be a role model for all of us today. Every one of us really, when you learn about the Smith family, you realize that all of us have a long way to go and we can really raise the bar. Daniel Peterson commented, if the Hurlbut Howe affidavits cannot be trusted on matters that can be quantified and tested, there seems little reason to trust their judgments in the less tangible matter of character, unquote. In other words, here's the Hurlbut Howe affidavits in Mormonism Unveiled, the ones that Bushman takes seriously and bases his new narrative on, primarily. Here's these statements, and we look at them and we say, okay, are they true? Is the story that they're telling about Joseph Smith true? Well, if we look at these statements and we say, what can we test? There's parts where the people say, well, Joseph Smith was violent to me and he stole X, Y, and Z from me. Well, and the Smiths say, no, he didn't. That's a lie. Okay, so you can go back and forth on who's a more credible person. But if we step back and we look at these statements and say, okay, well, what are the details in those statements that can actually be tested? The quantifiable facts. And we check those facts and we find, actually, these statements don't hold up. And when we actually test them on the things that we can test them on, and we find that they contain many lies and fabrications, then we really need to take a step back and say, should we be trusting them on the intangible facts? Because if they're not true on the scientific facts, then how could they be true on the others? And we really need to reassess, why are we considering these statements worthy evidence? Because you see, this is one of the arguments that progressives make when they're trying to defend the magical worldview. They say, well, yes, Willard Chase, he's not really credible. Hurlbut, and yeah, there's some questionable things. But altogether, when we have so many, all of them discreditable people, but so many discreditable sources all telling the story, then altogether they build a new truth. Well, let's think about this as if we were in a court of law. If we're sitting here in a court of law, 6 lying witnesses doesn't make a new truth. 6 lying witnesses does not say, well, altogether, because there's 6 lying witnesses and not one lying witness, suddenly we're going to accept the 6 lying witnesses as true. It just makes no sense. And not only that, but it makes absolutely no sense because so many progressive historians, they'll go into these statements and they'll cherry pick, right? They'll be like, well, they're talking about the Smiths being lazy. Well, we know that's not true because we can prove it. But so let's just move that part out. But this part in here about the Smiths doing treasure hunting, let's keep that part. Or, here's this other little part over here about Joseph Smith Sr. having issues with drinking. And let's keep that because that supports our new narrative. No, you can't do that. When you look at a witness and when the witnesses contradict themselves and sometimes even contradict their own testimony, then that is when we need to step back and say, why are we giving this new narrative credibility? And that is a question we all need to be asking ourselves. Because at the end of the day, we had 2 different stories. We had the stories being told in Mormonism Unveiled and similar publications, and then we had the stories told by Joseph F. Smith and the Smith family. And they said, absolutely not. This whole story about Joseph Smith being involved in treasure digging is absolutely nonsense. Joseph F. Smith made a marvelous statement. He said, in 1820, as I have said, Joseph Smith received a revelation in which he claimed that God had declared that he was about to restore the ancient gospel in its purity and many other glorious things. He's talking about the first vision, right? Then he says, in consequence of this, Joseph Smith became very notorious in the neighborhood where he resided, and people began to regard him with a great deal of suspicion. He was at once called an impostor, and a few years later he was styled by his enemies Old Joe Smith. His fame became known throughout the United States. So we're recognizing, again, this is kind of what William Smith pointed out. He said, people didn't have a problem with us. We were respectable members of society until Joseph Smith started talking about this religious stuff. And then all of a sudden, we became the crazy wackos, and everybody were competing essentially in all of the nasty stories they could tell about us that are just that. They're stories, they're nonsense, they're idle rumors, and they're lies. Joseph F. Smith said that Joseph Smith was called a money digger and many other contemptuous things. He said, if you'll look at his history and at the character of his parents and surroundings, and consider the object of his life, you can discover how much consistency there was in the charges brought against him, right? Let's look at the Smith family. Let's look at their farm. Let's look at how they lived. Let's look at their character. Let's look at how Joseph Smith lived the rest of his life. We can even look at the Smith family relatives. We can look at his grandparents. Do we see anything? Do you ever see anything that supports this idea of a magical culture? And the answer is no, not even in his relatives, even the relatives that didn't join the church. There's nothing. This family was a very strict, puritanical Christian family. Joseph F. Smith continues. He says, all of this was done to injure him. All of these lies were stirred up to injure him. He was neither old, nor a money digger, nor an impostor, nor in any manner deserving of the epithets which they applied to him. He had never injured anybody, nor robbed anybody. He never did anything for which he could be punished by the laws under which he lived. When he was between 17 and 18 years of age, he received another heavenly manifestation, and some great and glorious things were revealed to him. And for 4 years subsequently, he received visits from a heavenly messenger. He did not claim he was in communication with wicked men or demons from the lower regions, end quote. So this is just one of the quotes of Joseph F. Smith, who was Joseph Smith's nephew, of course, saying, this isn't true. This story is nonsense. And so many progressive historians have mocked this traditionalist story, saying, well, now we know it's not true. Well, now we know the truth. Well, now we know there was more to the story. But when we look at the research done by Donald Enders and other scientific facts, we discover that, you know what? Ezra Taft Benson, Gordon B. Hinckley, Joseph F. Smith, they're vindicated. They were right all along. The story of the Smiths is a story of honor and a story of integrity, and now we can prove that with data. So when we look at all of this controversy. We say, okay, yes, okay, so here's the Smiths, and they have this amazing farm, and think about what it took to leave that farm. Think about how much work that they put in and that the work ethic that they had as a family. Why would people do so much, stir up so much hurt against them? And one of the best ways to kind of look at this in a new perspective is to recognize that Joseph Smith is a type of Jesus Christ. And why that's significant is because when you look at the life of Jesus Christ, you discover that Jesus Christ was accused of many of the same things that Joseph Smith is accused of today by the progressives. If you take, progressive history accuses Joseph Smith of these things, of being involved in magic, of having issues with liquor, of being vengeful. And then you go and look at Jesus Christ. Guess what? Just from the records that we have, which is not a lot, but just from the records that we have of the Lord's life, we discover that Jesus Christ was accused of the same thing. You have Jesus Christ in Matthew 9 and Matthew 12. The Pharisees are coming to him and they're accusing him. They're saying, you're involving yourself with power from Satan. You've made leagues and deals with the devil. You're in league with the devil. He's essentially, translate this into 21st century language. They're accusing him of magical activity. They're saying Jesus Christ is involved in magic. Well, that's the same thing. That is the same accusation that is being made against Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith today is being accused of magic, occultic, satanic activity. And again, we have to look at this and we have to say, okay, which source is credible? Are we going to accept Mormonism Unveiled, even though we can clearly prove that those individuals who made those affidavits were lying? When you look at it, say, okay, well, which source are you going to take as credible? This is absolutely fundamental. To understand the difference between traditionalist and progressive history, you have to understand how to approach sources. And the best way to look at this is to look at this, just to use an example, think about how you, as a historian, would approach the life of Jesus Christ, because you have a lot of different sources. A lot of people knew Jesus Christ, and some people loved him. Some people said he was amazing, and he was compassionate, and he was sacrificing, and he just was a man of honor and integrity. But then you have others who are telling a very different story. Think about if we were here in a court of law and we were trying to figure out, okay, who is Jesus Christ? Peter, James, John get up and they give their testimony. Mary Magdalene gets up and says, this is the Jesus Christ that I know. This is how he treated women, da-da-da. And then Caiaphas gets up. He's the high priest that essentially put the Lord to death. He was the high priest over the Jewish church. Here you have Herod and Pilate, or others who kind of sat on the fence like Nicodemus or Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus Christ. What would be their story if they got up? It's not going to align with Peter, James, and John. And so if we are going to take Bushman's approach to history, we're going to sit here and we're going to say, well, you know what? Peter, James, and John are nice guys, but guys, they're fishermen. Like, let's be serious here. They're fishermen. They have no academic degrees or anything. They're definitely going to be biased because they're on Jesus Christ's side. So let's go talk to Caiaphas. Caiaphas is definitely more objective because he hasn't been brainwashed into the group, right? So let's go see what Caiaphas has to say. And let's give him not just equal footing with John the Baptist or Paul or Matthew or Mark or John. Let's give him even preferential treatment. That's why when Bushman writes Rough Stone Rolling, he gives preferential treatment to the Mormonism Unveiled affidavits. The affidavits in Mormonism Unveiled are given preference. They're given more credibility than the statements of the Smith family and Joseph Smith himself in Rough Stone Rolling. That is the approach taken in Rough Stone Rolling. And it really comes down to each individual has to decide for themselves. What am I going to believe? Am I going to follow the path of integrity? Am I going to say, okay, look at it. These affidavits can now be shown to have inaccurate information where the individuals who gave the affidavits clearly lied and clearly There are a Caiaphas and a Herod and a Pilate perspective on the life of Joseph Smith. And you have to decide, is that true history? Is that the history that you want to base your understanding from? And it really comes down to every person has to decide. For Bushman, he says, the first thing I decided is I'm not going to dismiss Hurlbut's affidavits. Bushman says, I'm taking them as credible. Academic historians had taken them seriously. So should I. So that's Bushman's perspective. He is not going to dismiss Hurlbut's affidavits. He's like, people like Hugh Nibley and others, they dismissed Hurlbut's affidavits with a wave of a hand. But I'm taking them seriously. Bushman's here to save the day. So that is where this shift really occurred. And it's a shift that is becoming more and more influential. Let's just take a moment to look at some examples just in the last couple of years to see how influential this new magical worldview is becoming among members of the church. In 2020, then Alex Boye produced a music video for this musical that he wanted to create called American Prophet. And it's very interesting that in a part of the music video, he actually refers to Joseph Smith as a strange, enchanted boy. A strange, enchanted boy. The environment and the coloring and the music supports leads one towards this magical worldview. You have Anthony Sweat, who is an artist and a professor at BYU, and he's taken it upon himself to say, you know what, we don't have any artwork showing this new narrative, this progressive view of Joseph Smith. And so he's taken it upon himself to produce that artwork. This is some screenshots right from Anthony Sweat's website. And you can see here's the Harmony Treasure Seeker. Here's a painting of, here's Joseph Smith with a dark occultic seer stone. And he is directing the men, presumably, where to dig for the treasure. And Joseph Smith is now the Harmony Treasure Seeker, right? Okay, so here we're seeing where we've been talking about all of these affidavits and this alternative view of Joseph Smith. And here it's being presented by a Latter-day Saint artist as fact that this is how it is. Joseph Smith was the Harmony Treasure Seeker. Here's Joseph Smith digging a well and finding a stone. And ironically, the painting is titled Gazelem, a stone, which is a complete wresting of the scripture in Alma. But that's a whole nother discussion. Here is a painting, The Gift and Power of God is the title. And it's promoting the idea that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon using a seer stone in a hat, which we can now demonstrate is completely historically inaccurate. Joseph Smith did not translate the Book of Mormon using a seer stone in a hat. And you can get more information on that from our book, Seer Stone, v. Urim and Thummim, as well as some other materials by the Joseph Smith Foundation. But that history has been entirely debunked by looking at the statement. There is no credible statement supporting the idea that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon using a seer stone in a hat. And then here is Oliver Cowdery in The Gift of the Rod, portraying Oliver Cowdery as this water witcher. And we're going to do a video here through the Joseph Smith Foundation vidcast debunking that idea because it is not true. There is no historical merit to support it. This was a video that was done by some individuals on YouTube, again, members of the church, and it's Joseph Smith treasure hunting, seer stones, Emma Smith. And again, these individuals, they're just kids. They don't understand the history. They're not fluent with the sources. You can tell that very quickly by just watching it very briefly. This was another podcast that was done defending Joseph Smith and weird magic shiz. Again, these individuals, this is not made to, we're not singling anyone out, trying to criticize anyone here. We're just trying to show, okay, these young men and young women don't understand the sources. They don't understand the history behind it. They don't understand what is the truth, what's fact versus fiction. They're believing what they are being told. And they don't know that Ezra Taft Benson and Gordon B. Hinckley and others said that this new narrative was basically bunk. They don't know that the data proves that wrong. They don't know, there's no credible sources. They're just believing what they've been told and then spreading the misinformation, and it's spreading. And unfortunately, the tragedy is that so many members of the church are struggling with their testimony because of this new narrative, and it's a tragedy because it's unnecessary. No one needs to be struggling because this information can easily be shown with credible history that facts, real data, and real history supports the traditional narrative of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It supports the character of Joseph Smith. And there is no reason why we need to apologize. There is no reason why we need to be ashamed of defending the character and the mission of Joseph Smith and the Restoration. We're going to finish out here with a statement by Gordon B. Hinckley. And to understand the history behind that statement, we have to know just a little bit about when Richard Bushman really got started with his Joseph Smith research. He was pushed into that research really by Leonard Arrington, who was the church historian for a period of time. And it was Leonard Arrington who really was the father of New Mormon history. He mentored and he trained so many progressive historians with this view of changing the history of the church. He believed that God had called him to change the history from traditionalism to progressivism, and he kept detailed diaries detailing this covert, in many cases, an organized effort to change our history. And that story is detailed in our books, Faith Crisis Volume 1, We Were Not Betrayed, and Faith Crisis Volume 2, Behind Closed Doors. Well, Richard Bushman is part of this group. And when Leonard Arrington was the church historian, he envisioned rewriting the history of the church into the sesquicentennial church history volumes that they hoped to release in 1980. And Richard Bushman was selected to write the first volume of that history. So Richard Bushman writes the manuscript. It later becomes Joseph Smith, Beginnings of Mormonism, and the Beginnings of Mormonism. And Richard Bushman's manuscript was submitted for review, and at that time, several members of the Quorum of the 12 began having serious issues with it. And Gordon B. Hinckley was actually the point man in the negotiations between going between the church and the lawyers and trying to figure out, okay, how do we get out of this contract? We do not want to publish this volume that Richard Bushman has written. How do we get out of this? Because they were tied up with some legal contracts. And that story is detailed in Volume 2 of Faith Crisis, Behind Closed Doors. But what came out of that is that Gordon B. Hinckley was very fluent in this discussion and this debate that was going on. Again, it was Richard Bushman who was really the first, Dr. Christina Rossetti says, really the first to present this money-digging, treasure-seeking story of Joseph Smith. Not first in terms of he's the one who originally started the idea, but he's the one that took the idea from the anti-Mormon propaganda and said, let's normalize this among members of the church. Let's bring this in and let's adopt this and let's embrace it within the church. So Richard Bushman's really the first. And Dr. Christina Rossetti, she points out, she says, it was very tricky for a lot of members because here's this faithful Latter-day Saint temple sealer, just a good guy. But she points out Joseph Smith in the Beginnings of Mormonism and Rough Stone Rolling presents this context of Joseph Smith as, yes, a prophet, but also a money digger and a treasure seeker, the use of seer stones and part of this occultic world. So again, with the debate going on, when Bushman starts trying to push this through and have it actually published by the church, his manuscript was the basis for divided opinions among the Quorum of the 12. And the project was completely stopped. The entire sesquicentennial history project was canceled. Gordon B. Hinckley was the point man in those negotiations to stop Bushman's book from being published by the church. Well, after the Salamander letter, Mark Hoffman's Salamander letter, and that's a whole nother story. If you don't know that story, you can get our Faith Crisis Volume 1, and we'll be doing some other vidcast videos on that. But after the Salamander letter was exposed as a forgery, Gordon B. Hinckley gets up, and he gets up to speak publicly against the New History movement during General Conference in 1987. And he gives a talk that's very appropriately titled, Lord, increase our faith. And he says, quote, another phenomenon is described as the writing of a new history of the church, as distinguished from the old history. So again, it's very important. This term new history, the new church history, it's immediately what he's talking about is he's talking about this movement among Leonard Arrington and other progressive historians to rewrite our history. And so Gordon B. Hinckley actually brings it up in General Conference, and he says it represents, among other things, an effort to ferret out every element of folk magic and the occult in the environment in which Joseph Smith lived to explain what he did and why, right? This is exactly Rough Stone Rolling and Richard Bushman's narrative that he's trying to push. He's trying to put Joseph Smith into this magical worldview, trying to say, okay, well, let's understand Joseph Smith as this boy who and his family who dabbled in magic and occultism, and to understand how he brought forth the restoration. So Gordon B. Hinckley says, yes, okay, I understand that there is this movement to do this. He says, I have no doubt there was folk magic practiced in those days. Without question, there were superstitions and the superstitious. He said, I suppose there was some of this in the days when the Savior walked the earth. There's even some in this age of so-called enlightenment. But then he makes it very clear. Where does Gordon B. Hinckley stand on this? He says, the fact that there were superstitions among the people in the days of Joseph Smith is no evidence whatever that the church came of such superstition, end quote. So Gordon B. Hinckley was getting up in conference to say, I get it. I'm hearing this new narrative too, but I don't buy it and I don't believe it. And he and other traditionalists like Joseph F. Smith and Joseph Fielding Smith and Ezra Taft Benson, they were mocked. They were mocked as, well, you're just not trained. You're not a scholar. You are just believing the nice, warm, fuzzy traditionalist story, and you don't want to face the truth. But now what we are doing is we are checking and fact-checking the sources that are being used for this new narrative, this progressive new narrative, when we are finding actually we don't need to change our history. The traditionalist history is still standing firm, even through all of the testing and the probing and the investigation. Gordon B. Hinckley was right, and we do not need to apologize for the prophet Joseph Smith. We don't need to feel ashamed, and we don't need to feel embarrassed, and we do not need to abdicate our understanding of him as a man of character and honor in history. The data and the facts support Joseph Smith, and we can be proud to be beneficiaries of the restoration and the Book of Mormon and the work that he brought forth by the gift and the power of God. If you enjoyed this discussion of evaluating traditionalist versus progressive sources, and you're interested in learning more of the research that supports and defends the character of Joseph Smith, then please go to our website, www.josephsmithfoundation.org. You can find additional free resources. You can sign up for our newsletter. We also have books and documentaries that can further encourage and enrich your study of the prophet Joseph Smith. And above all, we hope that these materials will help strengthen your faith in the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that you will walk away with a greater testimony and a greater love and a greater appreciation for the prophet Joseph Smith. Thank you.